It's interesting. I was a few years ago exploring a little bit more about the way I suppose I was practicing as a psychotherapist and in my work of doing psychological assessments. And I was looking at, how much medicine had played a large role in psychology and obviously psychiatry. And I was just beginning to look also at some of the literature that had helped people who had addiction problems, which is, I'm sure most of you know here, or maybe not, but most of you I think know that that is what LifeWorks does so well, is to help and treat people who do have addiction problems, whether they're behavioral or whether they're chemical. And it's done through a particular form of treatment called the 12-step treatments, based on the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when I was looking through a lot of the literature, I did notice that a lot of this word, spiritual, would come up. There would be a lot of spiritual self-help books. The program was spiritual, and amongst other things, there would be, amongst the bookshelves, you'd see all sorts of kinds of self-help books. But one particular thing I did notice, and also in my practice, was when about 6 or 7 years ago, I started to re-engage with a subject which I did in my first year of a very long training, academic training, which was the subject of philosophy. And I was sort of still slightly in the camp, once I started practicing, of very much being interested in psychiatry, in neuroscience, in cause and effect, and was becoming what they call quite reductionist. I wanted an answer for everything, why someone was the way they are, why people are behaving the way they are. And I think one of the most refreshing things I've found in the last few years is that I've returned to philosophy, not the be-all and end-all and saying this is the answer, but I've returned to some of the philosophers, mainly the ancient ones, which I want to talk about tonight a little bit. And I think had someone said that to me about 10 years ago, I probably would have crawled up and gone out of the door by now. But I actually found it very intriguing once I started investigating a bit more. I started reading, not in great sort of depth, but really just doing it for fun more than anything. I certainly don't want this lecture to be some sort of very heavy, deep sort of philosophical discourse, far from it. But I started to realize that a lot of some of the old exercises that some of the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers had written about, or people had written for them, because a lot of them would be talking in the street or in the towns, in the cities, just amongst groups of friends, town hall, etc., as Socrates was famous for. But Socrates didn't write anything down, and things were written down in sort of fragmentation. But I suddenly noticed that I thought, having been very aware and very conscious of the 12-step program and what that was about, and that it was a spiritual program, I came across the work of a very distinguished French historian of philosophy called Pierre Hadot, and that's H-A-D-O-T. If anyone's interested, I've left a reading list if you'd like to take one afterwards, just purely for one's interest. And Hadot was talking about the spiritual exercises of some of the philosophers, and that got me interested, as well as also I was reading some books by a psychiatrist some people might have heard called Irving Yalom, and who's written some wonderful novels and books about psychiatrists, books about philosophers, and how their influence has been on psychology, psychiatry, and psychotherapy. So I've enjoyed a lot of that, and there were other people I started to read again who are not particular flavour of the month with psychiatry or neuroscience now, but people like R.D. Laing, who wrote a wonderful book called The Divided Self at the age of 28. And I suddenly found the whole thing rather appealing, in the sense that it was very similar to my own conception of what the 12-step program is about, which is about treating the sort of whole person rather than having a very strict diagnosis and just treating symptoms alone. I think many of you may be familiar with how AA started, or maybe not. But for those of you who aren't, it was started, Alcoholics Anonymous, by a surgeon and a stockbroker in 1936. And the 12 steps have since become very famous for their efficacy and open-mindedness. The program of AA, or the 12 steps, as I shall now refer to it, does not necessarily suit everyone. And I'd never be... there's several people recently who I have seen who they just haven't wanted to go down that route, and that's been fine. We've explored other areas, but it doesn't suit anyone, and it's more than apparent that the success of the support group can't be supported at all by any research. The methodology is very complicated. It's very difficult to measure exactly what sobriety is. There have been one or two big research studies which have shown that it is successful, but I think the greatest success to show that the 12-step treatment works well, I think, is primarily because the fellowships and the meetings seem to be getting larger and larger all around the world. And I see, there are more and more in Russia and some of the former Soviet Union countries, and in China, and I think there are very few countries where one can't find a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. When I'm referring to Alcoholics Anonymous, I do want people to also understand that I'm also talking about the other fellowships as well. I'm just referring to AA as it was the very first one. I can safely say, I think, just very simply, that a 12-step program primarily is one of the power of it it's one of suggestions and not telling people what to do. And it suggests abstinence from the addictive behavior or ingestion of whatever substance is being taken. And it suggests, as it does there, up in step number 2, that belief in a power greater than yourself, or a higher power, or a God. But it is strictly a non-religious program. And I think they suggest that having worked through the steps will help change old habits and behaviors, to help one tolerate emotions without mood-altering drugs, and above all, in step 12 there, to help others to achieve sobriety by carrying a message of hope. Now, some people come to AA with a very straightforward drink problem. Others come cross-addicted, and some others come with a dual diagnosis, perhaps with manic depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, personality disorders, other psychiatric diagnoses. But more often than not, patients are experiencing an emptiness. And I think, as Viktor Frankl, the distinguished psychiatrist and former inmate of several concentration camps, wrote that a lot of his patients were suffering from this emptiness and this existential vacuum that he regarded as a life problem and not always a psychiatric problem. And this lecture is not, I assure you, going to go down any route of talking about psychopathology or genetics or psychotherapy, disease, the dis-ease, any of the talk about that. Tonight I just want to focus on an unusual area that I personally find interesting, and I think can expand, certainly in my own life, has helped me to expand my thinking about the 12 steps and also about how I treat patients. The two men who based most of their philosophy on what they had learned, the two founders of AA, Dr. Bob and Bill W., had learned most of what they did, their experience, from a religious group then known as the Oxford Group, and also in the writings of a psychologist and a philosopher called William James, who was the brother of the author Henry James. William James, a philosopher and psychologist in the United States, probably in the 19th century and early 20th century, was, as I said, primarily a philosopher and is bracketed in the school of what they call pragmatism. But I believe the founders of AA, the early pioneers, also used a lot of Eastern philosophy, as well as obviously Christian theology and Christianity itself, in the moulding of the 12-step program. A lot of people think, well, you know, it's divine intervention, how all this happened. It's just extraordinary that these two men managed to put so much together in such a extraordinarily condensed program. I also hear a lot of criticism about it. People hate what they perceive as the religious side. So I'm not coming from any agnostic, atheist, or religious viewpoint. I'm simply coming from a philosophical point of view, where I can see that the steps, whenever I go back to them, however much psychoanalytic, psychology, behavioral psychology, neuroscience, whatever it might be, reading I might have done, I always seem to find it in there somewhere. And in this lecture, that's the area that I want to look at. The similarity of AA with Western philosophy, particularly the Greeks and ancients. Now, you might ask, why am I choosing this area, and what good does it do for anyone in recovery? Well, I think identifying the two may seem also to be a pointless exercise. But in my experience of treating addicts of all kinds using the 12 steps and other psychotherapies, I do realize once again that I thought men and women in their recovery very often wanted to expand their thinking and feeling by reading outside the program literature, but not necessarily straying from the core philosophy of the 12 steps. Now, I found, as I said, my own readings in psychology and psychotherapy very helpful over the years, and I often realized that religions and Eastern philosophy such as Buddhism, Taoism, and also Western with Christianity and other religions, self-help books seem to me the most talked about in recovery. But having read philosophy myself in the first year at university, before I turned to psychology, I returned to it, as I said, after a period of research and very obsessive, very intense reading in psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, neuroscience, developmental, clinical, and counseling psychology, until I returned, as I said, to philosophy about 6 to 7 years ago. And I started by looking at some of the ancients, such as Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and through to the early Christian writers, known really as the medieval philosophers, but I would say more theologists, really, St. Augustine, his Confessions, and Thomas Aquinas, which I soon found out was way beyond me. I went on also then to look at other wonderful philosophers, where I found again that they had a way to live, like a program exactly like this, but for people to live a happier life. There's an awful lot of research at the moment and people talking at the moment about the whole subject of happiness, well-being. And I began to see that writers that people could possibly conceive as really quite gloomy, like some of the existentialists and the Russian writer Dostoevsky, and going through to the French Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, all quite sort of heavy, intense stuff. But I also found that many of these people were not actually that dry and dull, and weren't necessarily immersed in heavy discourse and analytical philosophy, but appeared very keen to lay out exercises in morals and ethics and how to live books on what Socrates called the examined life. Well, is the examined life worth living? Well, that is obviously something each and every one of us have to decide for ourselves. I personally believe, with all the ups and downs of life, that it is, and I believe Western philosophy has been ignored for quite a long time as a possible source of inspiration for addicts to move forward in their path of what Jung called individuation, sort of personal self-growth, or what Maslow called self-actualizing. Although the great psychologist Carl Jung gave Bill W. a lot of affirmation by corresponding with him just before Jung died, it was, Jung said, a religious experience, in his opinion, is what had kept people sober, and that people had to have a religious conversion to be able to overcome their alcoholism. And I'd like to look at some of the early philosophical schools as a way of what Jung called individuating. Perhaps the area I'd like to cover more than anything, and I have to say it's a gigantic area to try to cover in 35 to 40 minutes, but is ancient philosophy, as I've said. Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, well, they were the Freud, Jung, and Adlers of their day. Their writings are immensely complex, and the output is large. And in my opinion, it wasn't until later in the Hellenistic school, around the time, just before Christ and maybe just after, that there were several Greek schools started to dominate there. And you may have seen, some of you, the writings and may have read the meditations of, for example, Marcus Aurelius. I remember being given a copy by a friend of my mother's. She said, you open it at any page and it will be relevant to your day. And sure enough, she was right on the day of my divorce. One of the most revered and influential Stoic texts it was, although obviously the author spoke Latin. Greek philosophers were highly respected. The Stoic school was started by someone called Zeno, and today, in talking about the Stoics, I'm going to include Marcus Aurelius, but also two other philosophers from this particular period, which was after Socrates and the other two giants, and that is Epictetus and Seneca. Now, Seneca came into the news at the general election, in fact, and I think it was the social commentator and philosopher Alain de Botton was asked who he thought was going to win the general election, and if Gordon Brown was, how could he get back into number 10? Although he'd never actually been elected, but how could he get back into number 10? And Alain de Botton suggested that he read Seneca's two large chapters on anger. Now, whether or not the message ever got through to Mr. Brown, I don't know. But Seneca certainly writes quite a lot about that, which the writings are very similar, and I'll come back to that, to some of the work there, which is on resentment in step number 4 there. I'm today just going to focus on two of the schools, the Stoics and the Skeptics. Now, Stoicism, now the Stoic, or even the word Stoic, can conjure up all sorts of sort of fierce and pull your socks up images. It's a sort of approach an addict would certainly not respond well to. The Stoics actually sought tranquility like addicts, except without the drugs. The former Zeno was born in Cyprus and migrated to Athens in 313 BC, read the memoirs of Socrates, and had a passion for philosophy. But the first great philosopher to write this approach, which I think is very similar to the 12 steps, is Epictetus. Now, Epictetus was banished from Rome. He was a slave, freed from slavery. He was banished again by the Romans, age 45, and then he lived a life of great simplicity in accordance with Stoic doctrine. His teachings were faithfully recorded on submissiveness, humility, duty, and charity, and he also believed that, like the 12 steps, that for tranquility and peace of mind, he needed to mold his character in the effort to achieve self-governance and independence of external circumstances. Epictetus first caught my own eye after I'd finished a psychoanalytic degree at University College London, when I started to do some training in cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a therapy known for short as CBT, and at the Institute of Psychiatry and Warneford Hospital, Oxford, I was told in the history part of the therapy that the two founders, Albert Ellis, who was the earlier one in a different kind of cognitive behavioural therapy, but I won't go into that now, and Aaron Beck, who was the founder of cognitive therapy. Both were psychoanalysts, and both, Ellis in particular, had in their minds turned away from Freud and the unconscious to conscious rational thought derived from the ancient philosophers to confront psychological problems. Now, Ellis and Beck both of them felt very strongly that they were influenced far more by philosophy than they were by psychology. And likewise, with AA's founders, Bill W. and Dr. Bob, it was the philosophy of William James, rather than the psychology of Freud or Pavlov, that influenced them, as mentioned before, with a strong philosophy of theology within the steps. In particular, their reading of William James's classic text, Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, in the new rational Socratic questioning psychotherapy of the early 1960s, Ellis quoted Epictetus by saying, "A person is affected emotionally not by outside things, but rather he is affected by his perceptions, attitudes, and internalized sentences about outside things and events." And I think that's very important, because before we'd had the behavioral movement, which was purely on stimulus response, amongst other things. But here, Ellis was really picking up that the ancient Greeks were talking about that we had something called a mind. Now, he went on to say, what I deduced from many psychotherapy sessions was originally discovered and started by the Stoics, Cicero, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. And then Ellis got to the core of what applies, I think, to the AA program as much as any cognitive therapy, and that is that men and women are disturbed not by things, but by the views which we take of them. And even quoting Shakespeare and Hamlet, Albert Ellis quoted the bard saying, "There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." So Albert Ellis noted the similar principles also in Buddhism. The 12-step program, then, the very first requirement is for the person to find courage and to admit their problem, loss of control over their behavior, realization they have a problem, that it's not in the bottle, that it's in themselves, to accept the reality is within them, and when they start drinking, one drink becomes too many and 1,000 not enough, as the saying goes. And in other words, the psychopathology of addiction is denial. I do not have a problem. And perception change is required for behavioral and spiritual recovery. So as Jung said later in a letter to Bill W., just before Jung died, spiritus contra spiritum. He said, one spirit replacing another. A spirit in religious terms can heal, but ultimately that shift needs to come from within, from the other spirit in the bottle, but only when they are ready, and not just willing to change, but they do have to be ready. Rather like if I'm willing to go to work, but if I'm not ready and dressed, I won't be of much use to my patients. Now, if I look at Stoicism and later Skepticism as a way of enhancing our understanding, I believe that we can aid recovering addicts to stop getting stale in their recoveries, and just to open up another way of thinking from obsessive thinking, bearing in mind addiction is an obsessive and compulsive disorder, to reflective thinking. Now, an armchair definition of Stoicism, to be Stoic, is often criticized and condemned as being too rigid an approach to living life. Too rational, too narrow, logical, punishing, parentally bossy, a pull your socks up approach, stop whining approach, and be totally avoidant of all emotion. Now, I found that to be, I found it to be slightly exaggerated, but I find what they do say can be the very approach that AA might need, or some people might need. In other words, it's my belief that the feelings and emotions concentrated a lot in addiction treatments, and the ability to process and tolerate emotions is the core to a rational, happy, and tranquil life. But Alcoholics Anonymous' watchful eye on intellectuals and thinkers may well be misunderstood. And I think the Stoics approach the emotional life by learning and teaching people to think reflectively rather than obsessively. And I think that's very important. I think sometimes people in recovery are discouraged from thinking, and rather than encouraged to think reflectively for themselves. Intellectual thinking often gets confused, I think, in my own judgment, with what psychoanalysis called intellectualization, which is a major defense and very hard to dismantle. So the Stoics are not quite so hard-headed as I originally thought. They appraise their emotional life carefully rather than dismiss it, as the stiff upper lip was encouraged. And where Stoicism and AA may be seen as bedfellows, is ultimately an ethic of self-sufficient, benevolent calm, indifference to poverty, I'm not so sure about that, and pain and death. But although this may contradict the whole fellowship and relationship encouraged within AA, my own reasoning is that we are born alone and we die alone. And I feel that addicts very often need to tolerate, process, and use their emotional turmoil to reflect with reason in a way that is not always dependent on sharing with another human being. Being mature and courageous to weather the storms and equally the euphoria of life requires a stoic attitude. The sitting down and doing a list of one's resentments and fears, as it's said in step 4 there, addressing one's character defects and shortcomings in 6 and 7, may require us to browse through the work of Seneca and his broad 2 chapters on anger especially. Happiness, or in my view, and well-being, peace of mind, require moral action and virtue. And members of the 12-step fellowship are told that focusing just for today and the here and now is again a Stoic view. Seneca described the following. He said, 2 things must be cut short: fear of the future and memory of the past discomfort. The one does not concern the other, one does not concern me anymore, the other does not concern me yet. And Seneca continues, the sage does not plunge forward into the unknown, for he is happy with what he has, and don't believe that he is content with not very much, for what he has is everything. The AA philosophy not to drink today or worry about things you cannot do anything about today has again been expressed by Marcus Aurelius. And he said in his meditations that if you separate yourself, that is from your thought, everything you have said or done in the past, everything that disturbs you about the future, attaches itself to you against your will, if you separate yourself from the future and the past and apply yourself exclusively to living the life that you are living, that is to say, the present, then you can live all the time that remains to you until your death in calm benevolence and serenity. Well, the steps are about acceptance, trust, and letting go. They're about courage, as we can see, to confront shortcomings and demons and speaking the truth. And that consists in meditation, prayer, daily inventories of our right and wrong doings, as well as always being willing to pass on the philosophy of the 12 steps. Now, all this is a pretty tall order, I think, even for a devout monk, let alone those of us who have jobs, families, health, and relationships to maintain. But in the Epictetus's Stoic handbook, he makes it clear that some things in life are up to us and others are not. And I think my experience as a research psychologist and doing legal reports, working in psychotherapy on a daily basis, is very often amazing how I hear, when I see addicts in recovery, that an AA and NA, who are in NA or AA or other fellowships, that it is very often a prayer attenders learn by heart and use that helps them stay calm when alone, almost more than any other spiritual exercise. And this is what's known as the Serenity Prayer, which is said at the end of all 12-step meetings, certainly in this country. The Serenity Prayer may be familiar to some here, but is written by a theologian, they suppose, called Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1940s, although it may be also have been written by 16th century theologian, and I've even read an ancient Greek. But the Serenity Prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, this has many similarities with Epictetus's work. The prayer recited at the end of all meetings, but it is also a piece to meditate and reflect upon in total silence, alone with friends, or even, as many patients, friends, and colleagues have said, that they have recited the prayer even within the not-so-private spaces of les toilettes publiques. And as it happens, acceptance, courage, wisdom along with justice and self-control are the 4 cardinal virtues of classical Greek philosophy. So, even step 1, if we are to interpret that as acceptance or admittance of our powerlessness over our addictions, step 2 about courage and trusting to believe, step 3 about letting go and knowing what is not and what is in our control, and step 4 dealing with our grudges and resentments, and then we have a pretty stoic start to the program. To start and truly admit that one has an addiction problem leaves no time for half measures, and as AA says, but a necessity to grasp the nettle and go full steam ahead in our thinking, feeling, and behavioural changes. Following nature or God's will for us, here we see Buddhist links also of severing all unhealthy attachments and being, as the Gestalt psychologists emphasize, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I was a psychologist researching attachment theory for a while at UCL, and it was crucial for me to see, when working later as a clinician or seeing sponsors, how they worked, that how important security was within the fellowship. A secure base or a sound attachment is, for psychological well-being, very important, and based on ethological studies and mother-infant research, attachment research in its magnitude now does emphasize the crucial need for infants to have a good quality relationship from day one with his or her primary caregiver, usually the mother. I think crucial, it's not crucial, but it's important. I think Thomas Insel, a neurobiologist and psychiatrist, and who was actually head of mental health in the United States of America, which is quite a challenge, wrote a paper saying social needs from an evolutionary perspective can activate the same areas of the brain that trigger addictive processes in the dopamine systems of the brain. I'm grossly simplifying the neuroscience here, but it does seem to make sense that actually going to meetings, meeting people, and internalizing a lot of the goodness that one does come across in the 12-step meetings is very, very similar in a way to what was being talked about by Thomas Insel to replace the addiction. Yet, despite our need for security and safety, we do need to internalize these objects as psychoanalysis refers to them, and hence allow them to strengthen our character by allowing ourselves to be conscious of them and to keep working on what comes up from the unconscious, a term I have to emphasize not used by the Stoics, and when made conscious to work on them, as in steps 6 and 7, encouraging regular work on one's own shortcomings and character defects, moral flaws, inflated personality traits, whatever one wants to call them. So in recovery, therapists, sponsors, peer groups, friends, family, they all do that job if they're in recovery or in good psychological shape, so to speak, to allow for internalization for a self-sufficiency. But I do emphasize not a controlling or self-will run riot attitude, as AA says. I believe we need willpower to get to work, weddings, funerals, and meetings, etc. But self-will is about the opposite of acceptance and the need to be always right, seeing things in black or white, love or hate, and all or nothing. Now, it is that we need to take now a look from the skeptical side to think reflectively and calmly, that leads me to the other Greek school, which I'll briefly talk about, which will help us tremendously to avoid falling, I hope, into the all or nothing trap. Now, the Skeptics were founded by Paro of Elis in 360 to 270 BC. Like Socrates, nothing was written down, but fragments have remained, and it is has much in common with Buddhist thought. Paro accompanied Alexander the Great to the east, and it's his contact with the Indian wise men where he said he learnt a lot of the skepticism. The main skeptic is Sextus Empiricus, and in his outline of skepticism, he wrote that skeptics are philanthropic and wish to cure by argument, as far as they can, the conceit and rashness of the dogmatists. So at the beginning of his book, Empiricus wrote that he hopes skepticism would attain ataraxia, and by ataraxia he means tranquility. Peace of mind, resolution of mental conflict, everything in the 12 steps, and resolution of pain is the goal, while the cause of conflict is the deep human tendency to be attached to dogmatic beliefs which lead to conceit and rashness. The cure is through the logos, that is through discussion and argument. According to Freud, for example, he wanted us perhaps to be a slave to our neurosis, and with the help of the psychoanalyst, once learns to confront one's slavery, and then one is free to confront reality. In other words, Freud tried to provide a scientific method and reduce everything to cause and effect, an example being the Oedipus complex, which Freud saw not as a universal, which Freud saw as a universal development and stage all boys went through, although Freud was later reminded about the fact that girls existed. But it was only, and many of Freud's ideas were very fixed and set in concrete, that this opened a door for many great colleagues such as Jung and Adler to take forward their ideas, which were far more open-minded, even though not less impressive. Now, what I'm saying is here that there has been, and still is, quite a difficulty in mental health at the moment in a lot of the different treatments, whether it's psychopharmacology and whether it's psychotherapy, in a very, very strong theoretical basis. And people are getting more and more bogged down in theory. And this is very much what the skeptics were against. They definitely believed in, I think, what the 12 steps do, and is very much being open-minded and not saying that we have the answer. Well, of course, anyone here knows that this is not possible, and that human beings are far too diverse and complex, and let alone our genetics and social environment, for there to be one model to fit all. So the skeptics I'm always attracted to, because as far as the program goes, AA has sometimes been accused of being rather rigid and dogmatic. But I believe the accusation is false and very different from theoretical models in psychiatry, clinical psychology, and a lot of the psychotherapies. Eclectic, integrative models are being more and more common, more and more encouraged and common now, and those trained in hardcore theoretical models are beginning to see the world as larger and more complex. Instead of looking for causes, the skeptics would probably look for reasons. But to a skeptic, dogmatic beliefs, such as a rational approach to a problem, or just a rational approach to a problem, looking at just processing feelings, or believing in the unconscious will always consist of repressed memories and instincts, ignores what the skeptics call just ordinary day-to-day phenomena, such as spontaneity, creativity, decisions, open-mindedness, honesty, and willingness. And in AA, we do find some people who do like to take control, part of their personality, and that part of the thing is that AA, as someone once said to me, you know, is full of people from all different backgrounds, creeds, religions, races, and the principles of the 12 steps can come across from some people as very firm, rigid, and punishing. But some of these, and there are few on the whole, but still important examples, will be seen as a sponsor perhaps interfering with medical matters. As I once found out, a sponsor sacked his sponsee because he was taking antidepressants. "You're using drugs," he said. And then later on I've heard other ones, "You forgot to pray this morning. God will take note and you'll probably drink again." Another one was, "Treatment centers and psychotherapy are dangerous. All you need is AA. You must, you ought, you should," and so on. This calls for a sweep of the skeptics. The skeptic has no beliefs about what is non-evident, about how things really are, the dogmatic craving for security of belief as necessary, and even sufficient condition for tranquility of soul strikes the skeptic as both futile and harmful. And some of the late great philosophers are happy to call themselves skeptics, such as David Hume, Montaigne, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and so on. Skepticism, I think, is best described as a form of rational justification rooted in the life world, and he is thereby compelled to suspend judgment on all topics other than those which come to us as natural evidence. So I always like that. I think just it says that in, I think it's in step 10, if you're sending an email or you regret, or a telephone call, or you're just about to do something you're not sure, it says something in step 10 about restraint of tongue and pen. And I think that's very much like the skeptic thing of take a few steps back and suspend judgment. I think that's what skepticism is all about. So instead of telling the addict he is wrong, or that AA is always right and the steps are the only way and you must do 500 meetings a year, the AA messenger could develop very differently from the dogmatic one. Instead of trying to increase his mental mechanisms, the unconscious, God's existence, making amends to every person he says is proper and not the sponsee, instead he can just pass the message, not the addict, show that the program is one of progress, not perfection, and one of attraction, not promotion. And it is a self-help support group, not a sect or a cult, as everybody is voted for, and there are no leaders. He or she can both decide whether to put their faith in dogma, and whether it will give them security. But it will be a full sense of security, and can promote a dislike of the meetings and steps, instead of allowing people to be skeptical, yet also, I believe, stoic at the same time, to allow themselves to grow in reason and spirit with freedom rather than coercion, techniques, theories, or other people telling them what to do. So, just to finish, AA is a free and open organization, and I think it is with that spirit that I saw the possibility, for healing from Greek, and the ancient Greek philosophy was very similar, and from some of people, helping people from some of the most dreaded circumstances AA has been responsible for. My lecture has definitely gone on too long, and I pray it has not been too philosophical, because I'm not a philosopher. So please don't ask me any philosophical questions. But my intention was to pass on just a basic, fun, I hope, message that the brilliant ideas and way of practicing spiritual exercises, and in this lecture the unique ones of AA, are actually as old as the hills, be it Buddha or be it Epictetus. Whether or not Bill W. or Dr. Bob had a classical education is something I don't know about. But what is certain is that the ancient Greeks and later philosophers, right up to Wittgenstein and Heidegger in the 20th century, whom promoted better ways to live, and following that path, one constantly finds out endless similarities to the meaning of the 12 steps. And also reassurance that within the AA program, contrary to often criticisms in the press, there is little room for more and only gigantic admiration for the group of amateur and armchair philosophers who have provided a spiritual program that has saved and improved the lives of literally millions of suffering human beings. And that is indeed quite a feat. Thank you very much.